4 years after the launch of the Raspberry Pi 4 comes the brand new Raspberry Pi 5. This released at the end of last year, and I've been sitting on this for the last couple of months because I did want to talk about its features with regards specifically with emulation. And at the time when the Raspberry Pi 5 did launch, it simply wasn't ready for the prime time. Now, this brand new iteration of the Raspberry Pi promises much more power in the same compact size as you come to expect. The Raspberry Pi 5 comes in two configurations, the 4GB model priced at $59.99 in the US, and the 8GB model priced at $79.99. Now for this video, I opted for the 8GB model, which should suit our needs when it comes to all things emulation. It's powered by the quad-core Broadcom ARMV8 Cortex A76 processor, which is clocked at 2.4 GHz. Now the Raspberry Pi 5 is claimed to be up to 250% faster than the Pi 4, which is a significant boost if it's to be believed. You can also overclock the Pi 5 as high as 3.1 GHz, assuming you have the appropriate power supply to do so. Now over on the GPU side, it has a brand new Broadcom Video Core 7 GPU capable of hardware decoding up to 4K 60 FPS. Now, one of the absolute requirements this time around, if you do want to do anything useful with the Pi 5, is to invest in an active cooler. Now, the Raspberry Pi shop also sells these active coolers, and they are very, very simple to add on. Now, of course, there are different aftermarket ones you can get and different cases that have all sorts of cooling solutions, but the takeaway here is that you really want to invest in an active cooler this time. I wouldn't recommend using a Raspberry Pi 5 with anything substantial without an active cooler. Now, the other aspect of the Raspberry Pi 5 that is very, very important is that you must have an appropriate power supply. Once again, the Pi shop does sell the official Raspberry Pi 5 power supplies, and the reason why you do want to invest in an official Pi 5 power supply is simply put, the Raspberry Pi 5 requires 5 volts at 5 amps. If you have anything less than 5 amps, and let me tell you, most 5 volt USB power supplies that I have in my house aren't rated at anywhere close to 5 amps, and you simply can't get away with using anything less. You'll get performance issues, you get crashes, you simply cannot overclock the system in any meaningful way. You really want to get that 5 amp power supply. There are aftermarket ones you can also pick up on Amazon, but please make sure that you get the appropriate power supply for the Raspberry Pi 5. I can't stress this enough. Now, when it comes to emulation, this is obviously where I really want to take a look at the system to see what it can do. The Raspberry Pi 4 was a pretty good system that could run Nintendo 64 fairly well and Sega Dreamcast fairly well. But what I'm hearing with the Raspberry Pi 5, it really is a step up. And all of a sudden now we can introduce systems such as the GameCube, the Nintendo Wii, even the Nintendo Switch and PlayStation 2. Now, these particular systems obviously require a lot of processing, so we are going to take a look at all of these kind of higher end systems that you can emulate on the Raspberry Pi 5 and see if this small little compact system is up to task. Now, when it comes to emulation, Sega Saturn is a very complicated piece of hardware to emulate properly, and the Raspberry Pi 4, while it did an admirable job of emulating the Saturn, was certainly not without its issues, especially when it came to something like Virtua Fighter 2. The great news here is on the Raspberry Pi 5, with the LR Beetle Saturn emulator, we are achieving 60 frames per second without any changes, any customizations, any overclocking whatsoever. This is completely stock running on the Raspberry Pi 5. And as you can see, all these Saturn games that we've tried all run at 60 FPS. So this is fantastic news because Saturn has always been a very tricky system to emulate correctly. And the Raspberry Pi 4, while it did an admirable job, and there were certainly hacks and tweaks and certain settings that you could apply to get a good frame rate with Sega Saturn games, this is quite simply out of the box a 60 FPS experience, and it's quite awesome. But let's talk about Dolphin and up the ante a little bit. What about GameCube games running on the Raspberry Pi 5? What does that look like? Well, as you can see, things overall are quite impressive. There is a very good selection of games that will give you a great overall experience with Dolphin. Now, I will say that this is something that you have to basically test on a case-by-case basis. And there are definitely going to be games that don't run very well at all. But as you can see here, games such as Wave Race Blue Storm and Eternal Darkness and even Metroid Prime all run at a great level of performance. Now, I don't want to say that everything is perfect, because one of the issues that I have found with the Raspberry Pi 5 is that when there is a lot of geometry on the screen, when there is a particular scene in a game that has a lot of geometry, then overall the GPU, the poor GPU in the Raspberry Pi 5 is being completely hammered, and frame rates will definitely dip in that regard. And one great example of this is if you play a game such as The Legend of Zelda Wind Waker and you get into a section where there is a lot of grass. Basically, the frame rate simply cuts in half because the poor GPU simply doesn't have enough horsepower to keep up. But overall, things are pretty good. Another game that I did test that is very well known for beating up a GPU is F-Zero GX, and unfortunately, we're getting a pretty poor level of performance here as well. But overall, I'm quite impressed with what Dolphin is capable of doing on the Raspberry Pi 5. Things are a lot better than I actually thought they would be, and there are many games that you could consider playable and you would have a very good experience. So overall, Raspberry Pi 5 and Dolphin is a fantastic match, and I definitely recommend it. PlayStation 2 emulation on the Raspberry Pi 5 is something that I would never have considered to be even possible, but here we are. Now this of course is Aether SX2, which is a unfortunately discontinued emulator on the PlayStation 5. Now, getting this running was extremely difficult, but I had managed to do it. And overall, performance, once again, just in the same way as the GameCube emulation, is a little hit and miss. There are going to be some games that run exceptionally well, and there are going to be some games that simply don't run at all or run with completely tanked frame rates. And it really is a matter of trying to find the games that will serve the needs for you. Now, unfortunately, because the PlayStation 2 has a huge library of games, it's very, very difficult to test everything and get a good understanding of how the emulation is. But overall, with Aether SX2, the tweaks that you can provide in the emulation can really give you a solid experience overall. Many of the games that I tested did run quite well. None of them, I would say, ran at a locked 60 FPS or 30 FPS frame rate. There's always going to be frame rate drops, especially once again when there is a lot of geometry on screen, and the poor graphic synthesizer emulation is getting a workout, and you can see this in many scenarios where the GS is basically maxing out at 100%. And this is really the big bottleneck. The GPU of the Raspberry Pi 5, while it's doing an admirable job, simply in some scenarios can't keep up. But don't be discouraged by this, because PlayStation 2 emulation on the Raspberry Pi 5 is something that is quite encouraging, and something that I would definitely recommend that you take a look at in more detail. There are probably going to be quite a few games that run very, very well with this emulator, so definitely check it out if you're interested. Now, if there's one system that really takes advantage of the Raspberry Pi 5, it's undoubtedly the Sega Dreamcast. On the Raspberry Pi 4, we got a pretty decent overall experience. There were quite a few games that did run at 60 frames per second, but there was also quite a lot of slowdown in various parts of various games. And I'm happy to report that with the updated version of the ReDream emulator and the Raspberry Pi 5, this is without any overclocking, mind you. We're getting solid 60 frames per second across all the games that I've thrown at it. Now, there's probably going to be some outliers, there's probably going to be some games that have performance issues, but the ones that I tested, some of the heavy hitters, all ran near flawlessly. And I think that if there's not going to be a Dreamcast Mini, something that I personally have been wanting for many, many years, hopefully Sega's watching this and giving us a Sega Dreamcast Mini, because I'd love to have one. But if we can't get a Sega Dreamcast Mini, then a Raspberry Pi 5 full of Sega Dreamcast games and the Redream emulator is almost the next best thing. This is an absolute amazing piece of work, and for me, it's probably the most impressive emulation experience out of all of the ones that I've tested on the Raspberry Pi 5 to date. Sega Dreamcast is really rock solid here, and I absolutely am in love with it. Now, of course, I did test Sony PSP emulation with PPSSPP. Now, the great news here is that some games now can be internally resolution upscaled to 2x or even higher. As you can see here, we're playing Sega Rally Revo, and this is running at 2x internal resolution scale. We can also play GTA Vice City Stories at 2x internal resolution scale. But for a game such as God of War Chains of Olympus, which is one of the most demanding games on the PSP, that still can only run at 1x. With a 2x resolution boost, we're getting around 35 to 45 FPS, which is still pretty decent, but still not good enough to run at 2x. But overall, PSP emulation is rock solid on the Raspberry Pi, and one of the highlights for sure. The last system that I did want to test was arcade. Now, I tested a couple of games here that I feel like are quite important that people are going to be interested in. The first one is Killer Instinct 1 and 2. This is something that has been a long-standing issue with the Raspberry Pi series, where Killer Instinct doesn't run very well. Now, I heard that on the Pi 4, with overclocking, you could get it to run quite well, but on the Raspberry Pi 5, you can see here it's running at 60 frames per second. Now, one thing I do want to note is that even though the counter does say 60 FPS, there are pauses and hitches, and there are certain parts of the game that you can tell that it's skipping frames. Now, I'm not really sure overall if the RetroArch emulation is not telling me the right thing, or if it's just something that's happening internally. But overall, when you get into a stage, it plays quite well, and that is really the main thing. But there are definitely some stutters, some hitches, some pauses during kind of the cutscenes and during some of the, the transition sequences in the game. But this overall is the best version of Killer Instinct you're going to play on a Raspberry Pi, so I can definitely recommend it. Now, the other system that I did want to test was the Cave CV1000. Now, for those people that love their shoot 'em up games and know about cave shooters, the CV1000 set of games is something that was brought into FB Neo, I think about a couple of years ago, and these particular shoot 'em ups require a lot of processing power. You can see there is a lot going on. These are these bullet hell shooters that really have a lot of activity, a lot of physics, a lot of bullet physics that are happening, and a lot of explosions. Now, these particular games, once again, run at 60 FPS, and they run quite well, but there is just something not right about these games for me. As someone that does own original hardware, I do own a couple of original Cave CV1000 PCBs, I can tell immediately there's just something off about the overall emulation. I'm not sure what it is. I can't quite put my finger on it, but it almost feels like it's skipping frames, like there's like a 1 frame skip option set hard-coded into the emulation. And obviously this is not the case, but it just doesn't feel as smooth as it should. And maybe that's just kind of my expectations, kind of my high expectations of owning original hardware. But for the average person that wants to play these CV1000 cave shooters, you're going to have a pretty good experience. And I might add, this is on a stock Raspberry Pi 5 with no overclocking. So overall, I'm very impressed with the Raspberry Pi 5. It represents fantastic performance for the price that you're paying. For around $100, it's almost unparalleled. The only real thing that I have to take away from this is that for about $250, you start getting into the mini PC route. And there are some really great mini PCs that you can pick up that do a much better job than what we're seeing here. But overall, I'm very, very impressed with the Raspberry Pi 5. And it has really exceeded all my expectations as far as the amount of performance that it has under the hood. But we are going to leave it here for today's episode, guys. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you liked it, don't forget to leave me a thumbs up, and I'll catch you guys in the next episode. Bye for now.